Hello, this is Scottish Independence Podcast episode number 186. Now, a couple of people have been asking me in the comments, are we going to be getting back to long-form interviews? And the answer to that is definitely yes, but not for the next couple of episodes. This one's very current events, some of the more outrageous and bizarre things about what's going on just now. Then the next one, as we occasionally do, is a bit of a comedy episode. And then from there we'll be back to the interviews. So sooner rather than later, definitely. Now, on to this week's show. The first thing up is a little clip that Boris Johnson does not want you to hear. Apparently it was reported that this was taken out of BBC reports because they didn't want it out there that Boris Johnson had actually said business as usual. So here it is, Boris Johnson saying business as usual.
A Cobra meeting on coronavirus, and I think it's very important to stress that this is a problem that I think is likely to become more significant for this country in the course of the next days and weeks, and therefore that we've been making every possible preparation for that, and this country is very, very well prepared. We've agreed we've got a fantastic NHS, we've got fantastic testing systems, amazing surveillance of the spread of disease, but we've also agreed a plan so that as and when, if and when it starts to spread, as I'm afraid it looks likely that it will, we are in a position to take the steps that will be necessary will be reasonable, will be possible to contain the spread of the disease, and as far as we can, and also to protect the most vulnerable. And we'll be developing that plan or announcing the details of that plan, not just tomorrow, but in the course of the days and weeks ahead as the thing develops. Now, don't forget, Laura, that it is still the case that the single most useful thing that we can all do to support our NHS to stop the spread of coronavirus is to wash our hands. 2 times happy birthday, hot water and soap. Other than that, though, I wish to stress that at the moment it's very important that people consider that they should, as far as possible, go about business as usual.
Next up is Professor David Spiegelhalter of the University of Cambridge, who's explaining why he had to speak up in public about how the British government were misusing and misrepresenting his research and his comments.
But what he wrote for The Guardian has been much referred to by some very eminent people. But yesterday you tweeted a polite request to the Prime Minister and others, please stop using my Guardian article to claim we cannot make any international comparisons yet. Would you, a tweet is rather constrained in the amount of text you can deploy. Explain why you felt moved to make that clarification.
All rather unfortunate. I wrote the Guardian article as a response to what I thought was an absurd, largely media obsession with league tables. You know, are we bigger than Italy or whatever? And so what I was really talking about was the fact that, given the data available, I would not want to make any statement about comparing what we might call the top tier in Europe at the moment, which is Belgium, UK, France, Spain, and Italy, because they're all recording their data in different ways, got very different populations, and so on. And so the actual trying to do detailed ranking was completely nonsensical. And I gave lots of reasons for that, which you've been describing. Unfortunately, I didn't make clear that I certainly wasn't meaning that we couldn't make any comparisons with, say, we might call the bottom tier, Portugal, Germany, Austria, Norway, Denmark, who've got very low death rates comparatively and are clearly a different group of countries. And of course, we should be looking at those really gross differences in the way the epidemic has developed. But I didn't make that clear. I thought I kind of took it for granted. And then I was slightly surprised to find my paper being used by politicians to say, oh, we can't make any international comparisons yet. And I thought, oh dear, and maybe I should have tried to go privately to the people writing the briefs to say, please don't say that, please don't say that. I thought it would go away. And then yesterday in parliamentary questions, the Prime Minister then referred to me as giving justification for the idea we can't make any international comparisons. And at that point, I thought, I've got to go public and try to say politely, please don't use this article, which is a journalistic article, 700 words, bashed off in a few hours. You know, please don't use that as a justification for saying we can't make international comparisons, because of course we can.
Still on the UK's COVID disaster, here's a little comment about one of the scams the Conservatives are using to hide the fact that they're not meeting their testing targets.
So I have been tracking my health on the COVID-19 tracker app and then thought I should book a test. The test arrived on Friday early evening, and I opened it yesterday morning, and you have to register on the website, the test details. It wouldn't recognise my date of birth, so I telephoned the helpline, and I also told them there was no return packaging. And without a moment's hesitation, I was told to dump it, put it in the bin.
Right, so you couldn't return it at all because there's no way of returning it?
No, so I asked her if I could then please have sent a reply envelope and I could then do the test. And she said, no, that's not possible. You just put the whole thing in the bin and you then have to rebook a test. So I asked if I could then rebook the test with her, and she said, no, you have to register back on the website and rebook a test, but you can't then have a second home test. You have to go to a test centre. So all my test centres, the options eventually were at least an hour's drive away. I've got one this afternoon. I've got to drive, it's a 100-mile round trip. But the whole site is absolutely appalling. It's showing availability where there is none. It's not recognising postcodes at all. And if you live in Bournemouth and you want to book a test, you can go to Belfast. It thinks Dorchester is in Ireland. And options for Bournemouth testing this morning are Perth, Aberdeen and Inverness. And the whole thing is an absolute fright. It's a disgrace. And my first test has been counted as one of Mr. Hancock's tests. And I'd really like to know what the hell they're playing at.
You'd think any serious Prime Minister at this point would be actually doing something. Meanwhile, over in America, you know things are getting bad when Arnold Schwarzenegger sounds like 10,000 times the statesman that the president does.
There are two sides to bigotry, and there are two sides to hatred. And if you choose to march with a flag that symbolizes the slaughter of millions of people, there are no two sides to that. The only way to beat the loud and angry voices of hate is to meet them with louder and more reasonable voices. And that includes you, President Trump. In fact, as president of this great country, you have a moral responsibility to send an unequivocal message that you won't stand for hate and racism. Now let me help you write your speech here a little bit. As President of the United States and as a Republican, I reject the support of white supremacists. The country that defeated Hitler's armies is no place for Nazi flags. The party of Lincoln won't stand with those who carry the battle flag of the failed Confederacy. Was that difficult? You see, I told you. I have a message to the neo-Nazis and to the white nationalists and to the neo-Confederates. Let me be just as blunt as possible. You heroes are losers. You're supporting a lost cause. And believe me, I know the original Nazis. I was born in Austria in 1947, shortly after the Second World War. And growing up, I was surrounded by broken men who came home from the war filled with shrapnels and guilt, men who were misled into a losing ideology. And I can tell you that this ghost that you idolize spent the rest of their lives living in shame. And right now, they're resting in hell. I know that you weren't born with these hateful views. No one is. But the truth is, it's never too late to make the choices, to learn and to evolve, and to understand that all human beings have equal value. If you say, Arnold, hey, I was just at the march, don't call me a Nazi, I have nothing to do with Nazis at all. Let me help you. Don't hang around people who carry Nazi flags, give Nazi salutes, or shout Nazi slogans. Go home. Or better yet, tell them that they're wrong to celebrate an ideology that murdered millions of people. And then go home.
Meanwhile, while he's not dog-whistling white supremacists and Christian fundamentalists and not knowing how to hold a Bible up, here's what's going on in the president's head.
We have a situation where we're looking very strongly at sinks and showers and other elements of bathrooms where you turn the faucet on in areas where there's tremendous amounts of water, where the water rushes out to sea because you could never handle it. And you don't get any water. You turn on the faucet, you don't get any water. they take a shower and water comes dripping out, just dripping out, very quietly dripping out. People are flushing toilets 10 times, 15 times, as opposed to once. They end up using more water. So EPA is looking at that very strongly, at my suggestion. You go into a new building or a new house or a new home, and they have standards on where you don't get water. You can't wash your hands practically. There's so little water comes out of the faucet. And the end result is you leave the faucet on and it takes you much longer to wash your hands. You end up using the same amount of water. So we're looking at very seriously at opening up the standard. And there may be some areas where we'll go the other route, desert areas. But for the most part, you have many states where they have so much water that it comes down. It's called rain, that they don't know what to do with it. So we're going to be opening up that, I believe, and we're looking at changing the standards very soon.
Actually, while we're on the subject of Trump and the Bible, if you've never heard this comment, you absolutely have to. Here he is getting asked what his favourite verses were. Do you think he's a religious person?
I'm wondering what one or two of your most favoured Bible verses are and why.
I wouldn't want to get into it because to me that's very personal. You know, when I talk about the Bible, it's very personal, so I don't want to get into verses. I don't want to get into...
There's no verse that means a lot to you that you think about or cite?
The Bible means a lot to me, but I don't want to get into specifics.
Well, there you go. You can make your own mind up. The last one for today is a little reminder, what with all the controversy with the statues and things at the moment, a little reminder about Britain's colonial history. Here's a Sky News reporter getting absolutely destroyed by an Indian historian with regards to what the British Empire was doing in India. It's quite a wonderful listen.
The film about the partition of India has reopened questions surrounding Britain's colonial legacy. Viceroy's House, starring Hugh Bonneville and Gillian Anderson, tells the story of Lord Mountbatten arriving in India in 1947. Here's a clip.
300 million Hindus and Sikhs want a united India. 100 million Muslims do not.
You dance with your own kind.
My own kind.
Have some respect. New nations are rarely born in peace. It's got to be a clean cut.
It's a bloody axe cleaving right through people's lives.
We're joined by Shashi Tharoor, author of Inglorious Empire, What the British Did to India. Shashi, a very warm welcome to you. Do you think most British people have a grasp of what partition involved?
I'm afraid they don't. My book is, of course, about the entire 200 years of colonial rule, when Britain came to one of the richest countries in the world and reduced it over 200 years of plunder into one of the poorest. Partition was merely the sort of shambolic conclusion to that entire experience, the sort of tragic original Brexit, as it were, that took place in conditions that made 15 million people lose their homes and their lives, and 1 million lose their lives. So I think Britain certainly should know a little more about the things that it was quite directly responsible for in the subcontinent.
Before we talked, I was looking at a review by Max Hastings, journalist of some repute, military historian of some repute, former editor of the Daily Telegraph and other periodicals, newspapers, who was reviewing Neil Ferguson's book, which gives a flip side, an alternative view of the colonial experience. He opens with these words. This is Max Hastings. Most modern British school children are taught that imperialism was an unalloyed evil. That was in 2003. You don't share that view?
Well, no, because I actually know people who've done A-levels in history and have never learned a line of colonial history. It is not, in fact, something that British school children are taught. Perhaps Mr. Hastings was speaking of a different era, but certainly not in recent years has history about what the British did in their far-flung colonial possessions actually been taught to British school children.
Well, you say far-flung possessions, but I mean, yes, famines killed hordes of people in India, but so too in Ireland as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, British policies on famines, which killed 35 million Indians in totally unnecessary man-made disasters because of British policy, were exactly the policies they pursued in Ireland that led to so many deaths in the Great Potato Blight and led Irish people to flee to America. Indians, of course, didn't have that option.
If not the UK, I mean, you talk about the way the British impoverished India over a period of 200 years, was it not just one of those periods in history when part of the world enjoyed a technological advantage over others. And, nature abhors a vacuum. If the British hadn't poured into the vacuum, then the Russians would have done. That's what the Great Game, as it used to be called, was all about, how the British would block the Russians from getting into India and seizing it. And there is a view, isn't there, you may disagree with it, there is a view that says when it comes to that collection of European powers who were imperially minded, the British were the least worst option. I mean, compared, for instance, to, well, I mentioned the Russians, but oftentimes comparisons are made with the Belgians.
This is like saying you prefer being flogged with a whip to being flogged with a cane. I'm sorry, I'd much rather not have been colonised by anybody.
But you didn't have an option, Shashi, that's the point.
No,
that
the
such
point
was the
is,
technological
when you talked
imbalance
for example,
at that time that the Russians would have done it if we didn't.
Technological imbalance. Do you think the richest country in the world couldn't have bought the technology it wanted if it hadn't been subjugated by a foreign power that destroyed the industries it actually had and prevented it from creating its own industries? We missed the bus for the Industrial Revolution, true, but we missed the bus because the British Empire threw us under its wheels. It's as simple as that. We were the world's leading textile producers, the world's leading textile exporters, the world's leading shipbuilding country, the world's leading steel manufacturers. All of these industries were destroyed by the British quite deliberately. And a captive market was created by the British in India to unload their goods on this country.
When you paint that picture of what the India that might have been in the wake of the Industrial Revolution, people look at modern-day India and say, well, in a sense, normal service has been resumed. What's the problem?
Well, the problem is where we had to start from in 1947. The British left us with 90% of the population living below the poverty line.
Did they leave anything good behind?
Beg your pardon?
Did they leave anything good behind?
Well, they left a number of things that were not intended to be for the benefit of Indians, but which, once they were left behind, were transformed by the Indians into benefiting them. Such as, for example, the railways, which have been created in order to extract resources from the Indian hinterland and take them to the ports to be shipped to England for the greater glory of England. But, of course, once the British left, we were able to use the railways and continue to do so for the benefit of Indians, and particularly for passenger movement, not for extracting resources. Similarly, with many other British legacies, none of which were actually introduced to India to benefit the Indians, but only to serve as instruments of either British control or British profit.
But the point about the British control that you mentioned, it had to work with those who were complicit at the other end. So who's worthy of the greatest blame? Those who collaborated or those who instigated the programme?
Well, that's a moral judgment that I'm not prepared to make right now. Obviously, those who come into your house are the ones you have to blame first, rather than, let's say, the ally who let them in through the back door very often. But the fact is that both are complicit to greater or lesser extent. Every colonial empire had its so-called native informants, its collaborators. Sadly, we saw in the Second World War even the Nazis found collaborators in some of the democracies they conquered. This is not surprising, sadly. That's human nature. But it doesn't, however, excuse those who are attempting to portray the British as some sort of, to use Professor Ferguson's phrase, jolly good thing with a capital G and a capital T. It wasn't, not for those for whose benefit it was not intended.
I just want to share with you and our viewers a tweet from over the weekend by Liam Fox, British Secretary of State, who said the United Kingdom is one of the few countries in the EU that does not need to bury its 20th century history. Do you see no difference in the approach taken by different European powers to the colonial enterprise? Because there will be many people who feel there was a difference.
Now, I'm not an authority on the other powers, but let me respond briefly to Mr. Fox by saying that if Mr. Fox genuinely believes there's nothing to be ashamed of in British 20th century history, he might want to try the 4.3 million Bengalis who died in a totally unnecessary famine because of Mr. Churchill's deliberate decisions
do you want us,
to allow them to
do
die.
you want us to be ashamed? Is that what you want?
I think there is a
Britons
case for atonement, and atonement will only come when there is recognition of the wrongs that were done.
But those who perpetrated are all dead. A small handful of people benefited directly from the Raj. I mean, you can talk about the trickle-down and the repatriation of funds to the UK, but to many people living today in the UK, don't feel like they were beneficiaries of that.
there were vast sums that were sent here, Colin, to the UK, not a trickle. Vast sums in the billions in today's money, perhaps more. Some have calculated even higher sums. But I'm not here to talk money, because I think what's far more important is the moral case. I think what really matters is for Britain to look within and to recognise there's something to be apologetic about. Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, apologised last year on the centenary of an incident in which a ship laden with Indian refugees fleeing the British was turned away from Vancouver port, and pretty much everybody on board came to a grisly end, either on the high seas or subsequently at British hands. And Trudeau, even though the Canadians didn't actually kill anybody themselves, and even though that was also 100 years ago, did apologise. To my mind, I think just taking collective responsibility is a moral step that the British have simply not contemplated after 200 years of profiting from their empire. And I think it's sad. We just celebrated the centenary, or commemorated the centenary of the First World War in these last few years. It's still going on, really, till 2018. Do you know that 1 million Indians fought under arms for the British side? Do you know it was largely Indian soldiers that stopped the German advance at Ypres at the beginning of the war? Do you know that India supplied pack animals, food, clothing, rations, even rail lines ripped out of the ground in India and sent off to aid the war effort? And that the total contribution of Indians in cash and kind is estimated in today's money at about £80 billion sterling? I'm quite sure you don't know that, because the British don't tell you that. It's a great triumph for British arms, but India has been forgotten. I drove past a statue in London to animals that participated in the war. There is no statue to the Indians who've done this for Britain. I think at some point the British really ought to look back at their 200 years, not through the rose-tinted spectacles with which you see these gauzy, romanticized television soap operas about India, but look back at the reality, not just the financial reality, the reality in terms of human lives that were affected and transformed because of the colonial enterprise, and then decide if there is something worth apologizing for. I believe there is.
Shashi Tharoor is author of Inglorious Empire, What the British Did to India. Shashi, very good to talk to you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Colin.
The last thing for today is breaking news that a Tory office was broken into last night, and a Tory MP stumbled upon the secret recovery plan for both COVID and the Black Lives Matter protest. An office was broken into in Westminster last night, and the top secret recovery plan for both COVID and the Black Lives Matter protests was revealed.
Towards a New Economic Miracle, the case for slavery, by Victor Crosby. Slavery keeps down wages by creating a large unpaid workforce. Reduces population growth by splitting up families. Eliminates travel congestion by making slaves sleep at the workplace, simultaneously solving the housing crisis. This is brilliant. I wish I'd written this.
Okay, that's it for this episode. I'd just like to say one more thing. Recently I'm doing a big job of tracking down the names and titles of every single song we've ever used in the podcast, so we can create a Spotify playlist of every single song that has been used. A couple of listeners had asked for that, and happy to do it, but it's a bit of a bigger job than you might imagine, so I'll get that done as soon as possible. Another useful thing that came out of it is I'd never used this song that I'm about to play in the podcast before, and given the situation in America, I think it's the ideal moment. Speak to you next time.
The name of this song is Uncle Sam, goddamn. It's a show tune, but the show ain't been written for it yet. We gonna see if Tony Jerome and the band can maybe work this shit out for me. Straighten me out right quick. I like it so far, man. Yeah. Come on, let's go. Welcome to the United Snakes, land of the thief, home of the slave. Grand Imperial Guard, where the dollar is sacred and proud. Let's do this shit for real, come on now. Smoke and mirrors, stripes and stars, stolen for the cross in the name of God. Bloodshed, genocide, rape and fraud, written to the pages of the law, good law. The cold continent latchkey child ran away one day and started acting foul. King of where the wild things are, daddy's proud, cause the Roman Empire done passed it down. Imported and tortured the workforce and never healed the wounds or shook the curse off. Now the grown-up Goliath nation holding open auditions for the part of David. Can you feel it? Nothing can save you. You question the rain, you get rushed in and chained up. Fist raised, but I must be insane, cause I can't figure a single goddamn way to change. But welcome to the United Snakes, land of the thief, home of the slave. The Grand Imperial Guard, where the dollar is sacred and power is God. Welcome to the United Snakes, land of the thief, home of the slave. The Grand Imperial Guard, where the dollar is sacred and power is God. All must bow to the fat and lazy. The fuck you obey me, or why do they hate me? Who, me? Only 2 generations away from the world's most despicable slavery trade. Pioneered so many ways to degrade a human being that it can't be changed to this day. Legacy so ingrained in the way that we think we no longer need chains to be slaves. Lord, it's a shameful display. The overseers even got raped along the way. Cause the children can't escape from the pain, and they born with the poisonous hatred in their veins. Try and separate a man from his soul. You only strengthen him and lose your own. But shoot that fucker if he walk near the throne. Remind him that this is my home. Now I'm gone. Welcome to the United Snakes, land of the thief, home of the slave. The Grand Imperial Guard, where the dollar is sacred and power is God. Welcome to the United Snakes, land of the thief, home of the slave. The Grand Imperial Guard, where the dollar is sacred. Hold up, give me one right here, hold up. You don't give money to the bums on the corner with a sign bleeding from their gums. Talking about you don't support a crackhead. What you think happens to the money from your taxes? Shit, the government's the addict with $1 billion a week kill brown people habit. And even if you ain't on the front line when Master yell crunch time, you right back at it. Man, look at how you hustling backwards. At the end of the year, add up what they subtracted. 3 out of 12 months, your salary pay for that madness. Man, that's savage. What's left? Get a big ass plasma to see where they made Dan Rather point the damn camera. Only approved questions get answered. Now stand your ass up for that national anthem. Welcome to the United Snakes, land of the thief, home of the slave. The Grand Imperial Guard, where the dollar is sacred and power is God. Welcome to the United Snakes, land of the thief, home of the slave. The Grand Imperial Guard, where the dollar is sacred and power is God.